My name is Peter Jones, and the title of my lecture is Neo-Marxism, a Major Cause for Human Division. I will be speaking on a number of subjects, and I'll just go through them, subjects or sub-subjects. I want to look at if Neo-Marxism is a sudden appearance in our culture. I want to look at the history of American Marxism, and the thesis of my lecture really is the relationship between Marxism and racism, how those two things are brought together to undermine Western Christian culture. So that's the essential point to which I will get. And then I would like to look at the what I call the post-secular spiritual globalist Marxism as the future of Marxism in our time. So let me begin then by saying something rather interesting, that Black Lives Matter, which ironically was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for 2021, shows finally that the present public controversy over racism is actually the attempt to overthrow traditional American Christian culture. Its much proclaimed message of police brutality threatening black genocide is a deliberate untruth. And what appears in its footnote in its website is not at all a mere footnote when it claims to have as its source Marxism. It has the revolutionary goal of overturning traditional America. As they say on their website, upset the setup. As an anonymous first-hand ex-participant states, quote, oh, this is somebody that was caught up into the racist ideology. And this is what she says. She's anonymous, though. I have seen this racist ideology up close and seen how it consumes and even destroys people while dehumanizing anyone who dissents. That's a warning that this person gives to us. In other words, Black Lives Matter's Marxism is an essential part of a neo-Marxist revival that seeks to bring an end to traditional Western civilization. I know that's a major thesis, and doubtless some people will not agree. But I want to look at this carefully, and if I sometimes look down at my notes, it's because I want to be careful in how I say such an idea. When I was asked to do this talk a year ago, I thought that neo-Marxism was an interesting theory of some interest. But for a few months now, I have become convinced that neo-Marxism is center stage in our culture. This is no longer mere theory. And even the speech in the inauguration by our new president sort of indicates this when he includes in a call for unity to be aware of white supremacy, systemic racism, domestic terrorism, and political extremism. So we're called to unity at the same time. There's this evil beast out there that we have to destroy. And I wonder if we are witnessing the emergence of an ideological neo-Marxist coup d'etat. I use that phrase specifically. Are we engaged now? I never thought I'd ever say this in Christian America, but I'm asking the question, are we watching the beginning of a neo-Marxist coup d'etat? So the indication of the conflict involved right now in our politics is shown in the controversy between the ex-president's 1776 commission, that is Trump's study of this issue, in which he says, "Let us remember not only those who founded and built our republic, but him who made us in his image." That's the crucial issue, said Trump. And these phrases in the inaugural speech say the very opposite, of course. And so we have this conflict in our daily lives today. It's political, but it is deeply philosophical and theological. It's interesting that I've spent a number of years trying to describe the Hinduization of American culture. I began to do that during the 90s, and studied the invasion, helped by my good friend Pam Frost, of Eastern mysticism. I never thought that following Eastern mysticism there would be a Marxist temptation to the same culture. A oneist Marxist political utopia without God, where human beings can create their own utopian structure. That's the conflict I believe we are seeing today. Now, we've all been somewhat surprised to see this emerge. How does this happen? I never saw it happening, really, to tell you the truth. One thing that struck me, though, was watching in those riots during the summer was the picture of two lawyers throwing a Molotov cocktail into a police car. I said to myself, where are these people coming from? Lawyers actually taking on the police. In fact, those lawyers emerged from the American Academy, which is radically left and has been for many years. I have some statistics here. At Yale, the ratio of the faculty is 28 liberals to 1 conservative. At the University of Chicago, 1% of the professors gave to Republican candidates. Let's see. A 2016 study found a ratio of 11.5 Democrats over Republicans in most colleges. At Cornell, the relationship was 166 liberals to 6 conservatives. Cornell. At Stanford, 151 to 17. At UCLA, 141 radicals to 9 conservatives, and I could go on. One sort of interesting image, a professor gave a lecture to a ballroom full of 1,000 psychologists and asked if there were any conservatives in the room. 3 people raised their hands out of 1,000. So this has been deeply involved in present-day academics. That same anonymous observer says this, as part of the movement from which he escaped: critical social justice professors are evangelists for their faith, and the university is their mission field. Their goal is to take young students, inexperienced, eager to succeed, unmoor them from any faith tradition they might have, even if it's just American civics, and replace that with critical social justice ideology. That's the testimony of this person who was in it. She says, I was part of that countercultural movement, a vanguard helping to bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice. So we see that the majority in the academy are committed to changing the nature of our culture, to transform it from being a Western Christian structure into a neo-Marxist system based on what we call critical race theory. And so what was being taught in our universities was a massive God-denying but moralizing, the use of racism, worldview of neo-Marxism. And that's, of course, where all the owners and employees of big tech, big business, big media, and left-wing politics have been trained. So we shouldn't be surprised at what we now see as the enormity of this expression. It's come from a long period of thinking and teaching and reaching most of our kids as they go to college. Who would have ever thought that Marxism would be attractive in America? But Marxism is attractive. It's an optimistic view of culture. The idea that we can change the world for good. Just as Karl Marx, whose dates are 1818 to 1883, who was a German philosopher and political theorist, thought he could do, as he observed the mistreatment of the working classes and the employment of children in awful situations in these big factories. Indeed, we're all touched by that call to do good. The New Testament exhorts believers to share with the Lord's people who are in need and to practice hospitality and generosity. But alas, Marx chose not to define his way of thinking on the basis of the existence of a creator, but one defined by fallible humanity, effectively eliminating the creator. He did not believe that there was such a thing as a creator and called people to radical atheism, which many people did. He was following the theories of Hegel and the idea of historical materialism. That is to say that history goes forward by the notion of material goods, those who produce the goods, and those who own the goods and sell them and gain from them. The conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And that the solution to human problems based on economics is a violent revolution. This is all based, as I said, on what he believed about humanity and God. For man, quote, man is the supreme being. He says humans are sufficient unto themselves. They have recaptured the fullness of humanity in its full liberty. This is pretty radical. Atheism is a natural and inseparable part of Marxism, he says. So here we have what is a tempting theory in terms of trying to take care of people, but at the same time, a radically atheistic vision of life. Now, what are the origins of American Marxism? This was a question I asked myself as I was studying. One of the answers is the person of John Dewey, D-E-W-E-Y, 1859 to 1952. I suppose he was very like Marx. Marx was from a Jewish home. and probably was raised believing in God, but rejected it. John Dewey was raised in a Christian Reformed family and rejected the God of his parents, and began to worship creation by seeking to establish a system of education for children based entirely on the atheistic notion that human knowledge is the only true basis of human existence. He says, humanism turns the individual into God and is the source of his own ethics, and the school, that's the day school, becomes the temple of that deity. He became the founder of the Teachers College at Columbia University and was known as the most influential American educator in the nation. Can you imagine the influence? Training teachers in this Teachers College and sending them throughout the land. What inspired Dewey? Marxism. He actually went to Moscow in 1928. He listened to the Marxists. He didn't see all the problems that were there, of course. He was impressed by Marxism as a system. And he came home to America stating the public school is the greatest discovery ever made by man. The second element in asking about the origin of American Marxism, which, as I've said, we discovered recently has been thoroughly implicated in the way generations of the recent past have been taught, is what's called the Frankfurt School. Now, it's very interesting. I didn't know this, that Dewey was part of the invitation and the bringing of the Frankfurt School to Columbia University. So where he had started with this Marxism was then brought in via the Frankfurt School. Many people now know that the Frankfurt School was made up of a number of German Marxists who fled Germany because of the Nazism, and most of them, or a number of them, were Jews, I guess, and they were trying to avoid being taken in. And so they fled to America, and with the help of the Rockefeller Fund, established the Frankfurt School at Columbia University. The Frankfurt School is inspired by an Italian thinker by the name of Gramsci, who never really did anything but think, but his ideas were very powerful, and what he did was say that we really should leave the economism of classical Marxism and see the promotion of Marxism as a thorough overtaking of all elements within the culture. And so the Frankfurt School gave itself over to the analysis of the culture and the bringing of that Western Christian culture down. That was the goal of the Frankfurt School. Interestingly, Herbert Marcuse, in his book Eros and Civilization, which has as a subtitle, A Philosophical Inquiry into Freud, sought to bring down Western culture by the very notions that Freud had about culture being opposed to the free human being and had to be destroyed. Culture had to be destroyed in its messages of bringing people under its control, and so human beings needed psychology to liberate themselves from those ideas. And this, of course, is what Marcuse was doing in his book, Eros and Civilization. one of the interesting little facts is that he met Rudi Dutschke, a student, a radical student, who had been talking about a long march through the institutions. Rudi Dutschke had realized that if we were going to change America, he was a radical 60s student. If you're going to change America, you have to do other things than simply the Marxist rejection of the economy. And he talked about the way to do it would be the long march through the institutions, which of course explains ultimately why what I said earlier is true, how far gone the academy is into Marxism. It was because of this decision at that point in 1971. And Marcuse said to Dutschke, "I regard your notion of the long march through the institutions as the only effective way to teach at all levels of education how to use the mass media for a radical transformation of Western society." So you had these neo-Marxist scholars, and in particular Herbert Marcuse, realizing that the answer to bringing about Marxism was to undermine Western civilization. A third influence in the creation of American Marxism is a man by the name of Howard Zinn, Z-I-N-N. Zinn's work left a great stain on the academy. He has been called the icon of the left-wing professoriate. His textbook, A People's History of the United States, has been the only textbook in America's schools for scores of years, used by hundreds of thousands of teachers. And it was written on the basis of his own Marxism. He admitted to being a Marxist, and he said he attended meetings 5 nights a week of the Communist Party. But his book on the history of America was a totally anti-patriotic text, showing that America is irredeemably corrupt from its founding on. It was a full-scale Marxist critique of all the great patriotic moments in American history. Do we wonder why we have generations now who are not at all convinced that America is worthwhile as it is, and we have to change it? This is the key. This is, as I said, Black Lives Matter wants to radically transform American culture, not simply take care of black people. And so he argued that the USA has no right to exist, and he was a radical Marxist, and he influenced many young people through his book. Another influence on American Marxism is the appeal to many young people of socialism. Doesn't sound that bad. And of course, we've had recently Bernie Sanders, who calls himself a democratic socialist. None of these people use the term Marxist, by the way. Of course, we need to continue the long march through the institutions and not say clearly what we want. Though Bernie's political partner, a man by the name of Yanis Varoufakis, he was the associate of Bernie Sanders, said this: "Karl Marx was responsible for framing my perspective of the world we live in from my childhood to this day." So his right-hand man admits to radical commitment to Marx. I think this is the last element of why America is Marxist, and it's Marxism in the White House. I enjoyed reading the programmatic book Imagine living in a socialist USA. Among the authors in this book was a woman by the name of Frances Fox Piven, a prominent theorist of socialism and community organizing. Does anybody remember that term, community organizing? Well, indeed, she was a mentor to the young Barack Obama and later his professor at Columbia University. Together with him as a member of the Chicago Socialist New Party, they encouraged one another in thinking about politics. It seems odd, does it not, that the future president of the United States would be under the influence of such a radical woman with such radical ideas. But that's not over. President Clinton had a close friend by the name of Bill Ayers. And Bill Ayers was one of the founders of the Weather Underground, described himself as a communist revolutionary that blew up the Congress. And along with his daughter, who was also a member of, his wife, was also a member of the Weather Underground. And on their wedding cake was written, "Smash monogamy." That was their view of marriage. They became friends with the young Obamas, and in their living room, apparently, Obama decided to run for president. Another influence on President Obama was a man by the name of Frank Marshall Davis, who was one of his important influences as a young man. And he was an avowed anti-American Marxist. And some people think that the father in the question of Obama's book, the Dreams from My Father, were actually this man, Frank Davis. So you have a number of important influences. Now, President Obama never used the term Marxist, but terms are not that important. It's what you do with the ideas. But he included a number of Marxists that he appointed to his cabinet, like David Axel, Valerie Jarrett. All these people were from Marxist homes. Do you realize that? And James Brennan, whom he appointed as CIA director, as a young man, had voted for the Communist Party candidate for president. How, having been a Marxist, you become head of the CIA? Very interesting. Well, there are a few things that should make us conclude that American Marxism is pretty much well installed within our culture. Behind the scenes, to be sure, tucked away in the academy from what most of us don't know. But what is the function of the goal of these neo-Marxists? I believe that the importance of racism as a category in today's culture is because of its attack upon Western civilization. Todd Allen, a Marxist of the 60s, who invented the term white privilege, affirmed that to end white racism is to end capitalism. Notice that. Capitalism, you see, becomes a symbol of Western democracy. One of the founders of Black Lives Matter, Alicia Garza, summarized Black Lives Matter's objectives. It is not possible for a world to emerge where Black Lives Matter if it's under capitalism. So all the time you see this appeal to bringing an end to capitalism. Probably cleverly done because some people think capitalism is evil, so obviously you want to get rid of capitalism. In fact, the massive book I've just finished reading, Ibram Kendi, full professor at American University, says this: to love racism is to end up loving capitalism. To love racism. So obviously the racist system is ultimate. Is it to help black people, or is it to get rid of the Western culture? That's my question. Well, there's some interesting evidence to show that this is the case, that the racist ideology and the accusation of racism has for many, many years been part of a Marxist plot to undermine America. And I turn to a man by the name of Manning Johnson in his book Color, Communism, and Common Sense that he published in 1958. And this black man describes the vast attempt by Soviet and American communists in 1934 and 1935 to undermine faith in American institutions via a massive program to expose America as deeply racist. So you see how these two elements are joined together. You can bring about Marxism by undermining America through the accusation of racism, which makes a lot of sense, of course, because if America has deeply Christian sources and roots, then if you can make America feel guilty about itself, then it will change. And so I wonder if the goal in seeking to help black people is much more a desire to want to change the system as such, and that racism is simply a pretext for doing it. Well, Johnson lays this out very clearly. He says the idea was created by Stalin in 1928, and the idea was to reach out to everyone in the culture, and especially in the church. So we had to get pastors who wanted to be against racism as proponents of changing the culture, to advance the cause of communism in America, he says. It's interesting that Marx had little time for black people, even though the idea was to help people. He believed that black people were much more close to the animal kingdom. Can you imagine? Here's somebody who supposedly wants to liberate the black people. If you want proof of the connection between anti-racism and bringing America down in a very evident way, there's the project called the 1619 Project. So you claim that racism is essential to the American experience, and then you propose Marxism in its place. This 1619 Project, written by Nicole Hannah-Jones, a reporter of the New York Times, came out in 2019, and it is already a text used in 4,500 schools across the country, trying to show that Marxists have dominated American culture, and slavery, not Marxism, that slavery has dominated American culture from that early time on. And just to show you how committed this lady is, Nicole Hannah-Jones, to her project, she wrote this: Whites are savages and bloodsuckers. The white race is the biggest murderer, rapist, pillager of the modern world. This is the objective historian of the 1619 Project. It's interesting that many left-wing historians reject this attempted history as totally illegitimate. But be that as it may, it is an attempt to do what I'm suggesting. And of course, one of the scariest parts is the brainwashing of children into this ideology. You convince children that they are from a racist background and from evil slavery, and that they must do everything to change themselves and the culture, and you've won the next generation. The state of Virginia is instituting a program for kindergarten students created by Black Lives Matter and the anti-Christian Southern Poverty Law Center. Some of you who know these terms understand how radical they are. And children are hit with the insidious Marxist message that America is a very bad place, police are racist and violent, white people are naturally bigoted and have unfair privilege, all black people are morally superior, the traditional family structure is archaic. That's the message that comes over. And so we see in the influence of the Frankfurt School and Marxism, what we call now Neo-Marxism, the attempt to overturn American culture, change it radically into a Marxist system. To do that, in particular, we have Herbert Marcuse and his theories. And I took over the idea of my friend Joe Boot, who talked about the temptation of Marxists to take over the attributes of God. So, as God is, then we say, no, that's not true, but the Marxist state is God. And the first attribute of God that struck me was God's divine omnipotence, his knowledge of all things. That's, of course, one of the fundamental weaknesses of the Marxist state, that they hardly know anything, but they claim to know it. And indeed, Stalin said, how do we know the truth? And his fellow Marxists said, well, it's what the party says. And Stalin said, yes. And then somebody said, but what if the parties don't agree? And Stalin said, well, then it's my ideas that are true. And then somebody said, but what if your ideas aren't true? And he said, you must believe even my lies. So here we have a system that claims to be omniscient, all-knowing, and yet cannot know everything. But as a true Marxist, Mao, the Chinese Marxist, said, Marxist philosophy holds that the law of the unity of opposites is the fundamental law of the universe. The unity of opposites. You know, I studied a long time the pagans, and they talk about the conjunctio oppositorum, the joining of the opposites. In the case of Marxism, it's the joining of the opposites in a unified utopia where no distinctions are valid. You can live with all the possible expressions that human beings invent. As we heard in Mary's talk, this is the whole movement of sexuality in our day. The onist principle frees the sinful human being from creational binary constraints. So the utopia is a onist principle, you see, where there are no binary restraints. We see this expression of omniscience in the neo-Marxist use of what we call critical race theory, which, by the way, was invented by one of the Frankfurt School scholars. And I want to look at how the critical race theory claims omniscience and is used by the Marxists to promote that. Critical race theory, I would argue, is the methodology of neo-Marxism. Employing this new system, well, new for many of us, though it does come from the 30s. What are the key ideas in critical race theory? First of all, in typical Marxist fashion, well, I'm giving you this because I want you to realize that this theory claims to know everything. It claims to have put the world together in a way we can all accept. Unfortunately, as you will see, that's not true. So the key ideas: in typical Marxist fashion, society is divided into oppressed and oppressor identity groups. So this theory breaks the culture into two and sets two parts of the culture one against the other. I'm sure that's wonderfully omniscient. Oppression, two, oppression is indirect but applied via social structures for the good of the oppressor group. So what is good is what the oppressor wants to realize, what the oppressed wants to realize. I got to read that again. Oppression is the indirect but applied via social structures for the good of the oppressor group. Now I understand what I wrote. The oppressor group, the evil group, you see, via its way of arguing, manages to oppress the oppressed using false language. However, the oppressed respond with great omniscience via, quote, lived experience, or what some people call standpoint epistemology. Did you ever wonder where cancel culture came from? It's right here. If lived experience, if standpoint epistemology is the only truth you have, then you can cancel any other argument that claims to be true. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing. It's the denial, actually, of objectivity, and thus an extreme form of godless relativism. It rejects God as any source of truth, you see, and makes individuals the source of truth. But only the oppressed have truth, not the oppressors. And for intersectionality, I'm realizing the emotive importance of intersectionality, because if you just go with racism, then you maybe will lose a lot of people. But if you can include a lot of other oppressed people, then the system becomes more powerful and emotive, because it includes all the suffering people, you see. And actually, it makes an appeal that if you're an anti-racist, you must be in favor of affirming all these other systems, like homosexuality and transgenderism and so on. So it gives the movement a certain social power. But actually, it is racist in itself, because identity politics is based upon groups of people. And the Constitution doesn't recognize groups of people, only individuals. We all stand before the law as an individual. And so this is a dismissal of the individual for the sake of the group. So I was saying that critical race theory is an expression in a sense of the omniscience that is claimed, but also of the divine attribute of justice, the justice of the oppressed and the oppressor. It claims that the very notion of truth and what is just is the oppressor oppressing the suffering minorities. But the unfortunate result is that it produces endless conflict. This analysis of the problem can only produce enmity, suspicion, grievance, division, deep opposition, and tribalism. So we have in the culture, in the name of justice, endless conflict. Now, some other areas which this system proposes, critical race theory in particular, and Neo-Marxism, come from the teaching of the critical race theorists, in particular of the Frankfurt School, who claim to be able to define what love is. I mentioned Herbert Marcuse gave a Marxist interpretation of the 60s goal of sexual love. He pushed for a classless, egalitarian society where all distinctions are eliminated. He was called the Marx of the children of the new bourgeoisie. And in his book, as I mentioned earlier, Eros and Civilization, he showed that the goal of politics is to eliminate any kind of social oppression and propose the liberation of sexually repressed people via the Freudian emancipation of their instincts. He talked about polymorphous sexuality and the freeing of life instincts. This is the neo-Marxist form that was produced and proposed. This was Herbert Marcuse's goal to undermine American culture. Has he succeeded? Well, in the decade following Marcuse, June Singer, in her book Androgyny, towards a new form of sexuality, who was a Jungian psychologist, and I noted that Marcuse preferred some elements in Jung over against Freud, but she proposes that the spiritual age of Aquarius is also the age of androgyny. This is the new humanism. Now, what is androgyny? It's the confusion of sexes. But this is the great goal, you see, of this woman, the psychologist trained by Jung. This is the new humanism. It's without any sexual distinctions of any kind. It's androgyny. She says, we have at hand all the ingredients we will need to perform our own new alchemical opus, the great work to fuse the opposites within us. There we have it. Getting rid of distinctions in the binary, she says, the archetype of androgyny appears to us as an innate sense of and witness to the primordial cosmic unity. Here is Oneism raised up to this high level. Well, what is happening here? The rejection of gender distinctions is an essential element of the transformation of humanity in our time. All the binary distinctions must be eliminated, like classism, racism, sexism, heterosexism, ageism have been eliminated. And so the neo-Marxist revolution succeeds in abolishing Western civilization. Carl Trueman, in his important book, notes that someone can declare rather than confirm his or her sexuality is certainly something radically new in human history. You see what he's saying? Someone can declare, to tell you who they are sexually, rather than observe. And this is stated very clearly in the book by Judith Butler, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. This radical feminist begins her book this way. For the most part, feminist theory has assumed that there is some existing identity understood through the category of woman, who not only initiates feminist interest and goals within discourse, but constitutes the subject for whom political representation is pursued. However, there is very little agreement, after all, on what it is that constitutes or ought to constitute the category of woman. So she leaves it up in the air. There is no such thing as a woman at the end of the day. This, of course, is the great, if you like, success of the Frankfurt School. To totally to have completely reinterpreted sexuality to mean nothing at all. A cultural Marxist by the name of Michael Ryan, in his book Marxism and Deconstruction, says that I say about him that what he is saying is that neo-Marxism is no longer a classless society, but a classless mind and body. For he understands that tying the postmodern rejection of objective truth to the political program of Marxism is radical egalitarianism. I remember as a student, surrounded by radical students, shouting, "Hey ho, what you know, Western Civ has got to go." And I often wondered why they said that. It seemed odd to me. Now we know. Western Civ has gone. And that was the goal of the march through the institutions, was to undermine Western civilization. The universities, mainstream media, Hollywood now understand that biblical sexual purity must be undermined if the godless ideology of Marxist collectivism is to permeate the West. Now, another form of love, since that now is our definition we should go on, is the rejection of the family. I recalled, as I began on this subject, that I knew that Marx and Engels had rejected the family. But what was surprising to me was that this has not lost any of its power. Herbert Marcuse taught that the chief adversary of humanity is the patriarchal family. And now we have modern-day neo-Marxist feminists saying the same thing. We deserve better than a family, says one. Households are capitalism's pressure cookers. Back to capitalism, you see, that we keep coming back between the two. The nuclear family is training us to be inhabitants of a binary gendered and racially stratified system, training us not to be queer. This agenda deconstructs even the use of terms like father and mother. Even in the Congress, that's been a new rule that we cannot use terms mother and father and sister and brother. So this is how far we've come. Another Marxist feminist says, want to dismantle capitalism? Abolish the family. And another one says, state-organized communes can only come about by a generalized insurrection. That is classic Marxist revolution. So we are being prepared to look seriously at a social and even physical revolution. Well, I'm towards the end of my lecture. Where is neo-Marxism going? The leaders of the old age look forward to an even newer, the leaders of the old new age, I should read my text correctly. The leaders of the old new age look forward to an even newer age, the final coming together of the Western mind with its animistic spirit. Says Richard Tarnas, the deepest passion of the Western secular mind has been to reunite with the ground of its spiritual being. And this is what we look forward to in the future in post-secular spirituality, expressing the ultimate union of the rational with the mythical, the normal with the paranormal, the material with the immaterial, the human with the divine. One of the old New Age thinkers that I had in my notes speaks about this coming new consciousness. It is urgent, he says, this is Andrew Cohen, it is urgent that we begin to define a new moral, philosophical, and spiritual context that will be able to embrace the multidimensional nature of the human predicament in all its complexity at the beginning of the 21st century. Something within has been let loose. The invasion of a new awareness, irresistible and uncontrollable, has swept everything away. But what has been swept away is the binary. In a lecture he gave in 2012, entitled The Significance of Non-Duality, There is Only One, Not Two, was the title of his lecture. Why is it important that there is only one, not two? He asks. Because this is the essence of the new cosmology that has been the goal both of Hinduism and Buddhism, but is now the goal of neo-Marxism. Because the utopia of neo-Marxism has gotten rid of all duality. And so we are faced with the Great Reset, which is the organization of the globe in some form of neo-Marxist structure. We are witnessing in this new resolve for both personal mysticism, collective social justice, and egalitarian politics the beginnings of a new all-encompassing syncretistic religious vision. You see, neo-Marxism will not be secular. It will be post-secular. And it will be open to these kinds of religious movements. Because it is open to a utopia of equity, where everybody is the same, where all binary distinctions and all isms have been eliminated. It will not be the victory of secularism, but the emergence of a post-secular spirituality involving, quote, a renewed openness to questions of the spirit while retaining the secular habits of critical thought. I'm glad we included that. So here we are at the end. For this to happen, something quintessential American, must occur. For this to happen, the overturning of Western culture, something quintessential has to happen. It's the overturning of the Constitution. The Constitution is dismissed as a Christian document, a male Christian document that has to be eliminated. The Constitution is an essential element of Christian hegemony, and like other systems of oppression like racism and sexism, are the direct result of a Christian worldview. I'm quoting a scholar on this. Thus, the Constitution is labeled as the evil incubator of capitalism and heteronormativity. So a guilt-inducing anti-constitution ideology attacking racist white privilege is now taught at universities and high schools. Dressing itself in moral outrage, we have to do that in a once Christian culture because we do have consciences, which becomes the spearhead of future social justice in a coming classless society where finally all forms of privilege have been eliminated. This is the final form of multiculturalism by which the Constitution will be demonized and rejected in the light of progressive tradition, understood as Neo-Marxism. This obviously represents a massive conflict in our culture. The church will survive without the Constitution. So this is not an argument as such, simply defend the Constitution, but the church will indeed need to come back to its roots. And it obviously will value the constitutional democracy, the belief in God as the creator of rights and so on. But we simply ask if we are in the final stages of critical race theory that has educated Black Lives Matter and Antifa millennials into believing that the United States is the worst country on earth, and the underlying ideology of Christianity is an evil system to be eliminated. In the future, who will win? Those who devalue life through abortion, who seek to destroy religious liberty, who further undermine the family and marriage through its redefinition, and who find generalized sexual fornication perfectly normal, who are not committed to truth-telling because the end justifies the means? Will that society, greatly aided by critical race theory, which denies truth to its opponents, have the character and ability, let alone the desire, to establish a truly just and humane society and show respect and tolerance for the other side? I don't believe so. These are the creators of their own moral truths and will not be impressed by those of us who propose transcendent morality, cosmic intelligence, and a divinely provided redemption. The answer is obvious. The answer to my question, who will survive? Well, in the short term, the handwriting is already on the wall. Joe Barrow, a writer for the New York Times, tweeted that, quote, anti-LGBT attitudes are terrible. We need to stamp them out ruthlessly. In the Soviet Union, 100 years ago, 10,000 churches were destroyed and 95,000 priests were shot by firing squad. Rod Dreher's book, Live Not by Lies, challenges the reader to listen to the former Christian dissidents and survivors of communist totalitarianism. We are coming to, as I said, a sort of coup d'etat. How near, how far, I don't know. But the ultimate question is the truth or the lie. Is Marx Lord or is Jesus Lord? Melanie Phillips, years ago, a UK Jewish philosopher and journalist, stated The attack on Western civilization at its most profound level is an attack on the creed that lies at the very foundation of that civilization. And what's that creed? Well, it's the creed that you find known as the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. This is the point of ultimate conflict. Scott Lively, who for a long time was seeking to make sense of the conflict over homosexuality and gay ideology, 12 years ago saw the coming influence of Neomarxism. He said, in summary, the gay agenda is to eliminate the existing Judeo-Christian model of civilization grounded in marriage-based procreative sexuality to make way for an irrational and impossible cultural Marxist model, which imagines family-less, unlimited sexual freedom, anarchy, while somehow preserving orderliness in every other respect of human society. It reflects an insane and satanic delusion that breeds chaos and can only be stopped by unceasing reaffirmation of biblical values and the natural family by the rest of us. Critical race theory and neo-Marxism and their view of utopia is a modern form of the lie that rejects God the Creator, twoism, the source of our meaningful universe. As Scripture affirms, by wisdom the Lord laid the foundations of the earth. By understanding he set the heavens in place. Proverbs 32:19. This view believes it can save itself. This view believes it can explain who man is. Even though man is the result of evolution, he's the source of things, which is absolutely nonsense. So the gospel truth must be heard. The only answer is a convincing, robust witness, allowing God the Creator's definition of creation to be seen and heard in our lives, and his saving purposes by the death of his Son, Jesus, to be made known in our public testimony. The ultimate weakness of neo-Marxist utopia is its failure to conquer death. In spite of the imposing mausoleums, Marx, Lenin, and Stalin are all dead. Only Jesus is alive. This is what people need to hear. Only a courageous discourse at this level will save both the culture and the church. Thank you.